Hello, hello, hello. Welcome back to another Zeal stream with yours truly, Talk to Me Gooseman, or Eric Guzman in real life. And I am accompanied with three lovely individuals that we had in last week before the whole stream debacle. But now it is Debugging 101 Part 2, The Debugger's Revenge. That's what we have going on today. So thanks everyone for stopping by, and thanks again to the guests for coming back again. Greatly appreciate that. And welcome everyone in the chat, Dr. Argus, Dark Knight Studio, and J Toro. Hopefully I'm saying that right. Welcome. And so let's just kick things off. Um, I guess first thing is let's do a recap of what we talked about last week. And so let me click on that. So debugging 101 from last week. So I was inspired personally by the console log foo. I actually wrote a blog about it, but I thought I'd just write a little write up here for everyone to see on stream. So our takeaways from last stream is some console log foo. We learned some stuff, courtesy of Nate and Mati. I guess it was Mati showing what he learned from Nate, I believe. uh, so one was just standard console log, but we can get a little creative and use object literal notation to just do a console log in this fashion, where we just take the variables and pop it in, and we get. I didn't put the screenshot of what we get out, but we get a nice, beautifully formatted stuff. I actually showed this to one of the people I was pairing with at work, and it blew his mind. He was like, "What?" Because he was doing this format. He was like saying, "This is the variable. Put it, output it," and then I was like, "No, you could do this," and he's like, "Wow." So I'm not sure if anyone else's mind was blown, but I was.
My mind was for sure blown.
There we go.
Confirmed.
Confirmed. Mind blown. And then the next one was actually using console table. So that one was a pretty cool little tidbit, console table, where we go from doing logging out an array and getting this type of format here, where it's just like this object. We have to click on it and show the contents of it, and going to an actual table structure for arrays of data. So I didn't know that was there, and my mind was blown again from that. So that was super awesome. So thank you, Nate and Mati, for sharing those little things with us. And then we started doing a little dive into Rails, and we got introduced to the Pry gem that now comes bundled with Rails apps, I believe, ever since Rails 5, I think. I could be mistaken, but for sure it's in Rails 6.
Yeah, I think it's a default install on Rails install nowadays.
Yeah. And that allows us to stop code execution at a specific point in the code, so we can inspect what's going on there, and you just do that using the binding.pry keyword on there. And one last thing I thought I'd throw in there is kind of like a conversation we had, was that linters are not just for enforcing coding standards. So we talked about, linters. Yeah, most of us have encountered linters, but linters can help us find bugs early on, not just complain to us about spacing around parentheses. It can actually hint to us that, some code might not be correct based off its structure. And we've encountered that sort of scenario with React using hooks, and the ES plugin or React hooks would have helped us debug that issue significantly faster if it was enabled. So that's the recap. If anyone has any questions or anything like that, feel free to ask. But going from there, we'll start with where we left off last stream, and let's start with Nate. You were going to start sharing some stuff with us before things just went absolutely haywire.
Yeah, stuff did go haywire for a bit there, but it's okay. We're all good now. So last time we were about to dive into, I think I was talking about a package called Debug for JavaScript. That package is maintained by Cindersaurus, not an actual dinosaur, but a person. Guy's pretty awesome. He has like over 2,000, I think maybe 3,000 now packages. The guy's he's a machine. But anyway, he put out there a package called Debug, very generally named. And in it, it allows you to conditionally turn on debugging. So you'd leave a message in like you normally would a console log. And then when you want to turn it on and actually log those things, you can conditionally set a variable in your environment to pick up that log. If that variable is not set, then that log is just a no-op. So it does introduce an oh so tiny bit of overhead to your code, but it should, in theory, not impact performance. At least if you're noticing it at that level, you're a much better debugger and JavaScript code writer than I. But yeah, so if you could, and if you haven't yet, let's go ahead and install Debug and see if we can get it to do some magic for us.
All right, so it's npm. So we're using Yarn actually in this. So it's Yarn.
Yep. And you probably want this to be part of your production build, in this case, a React app. So don't add it to dev, just add it to normal dependencies.
And it's just called Debug?
Correct.
Let's go for it.
And let's go find a place to add a debug statement.
Sure.
So anywhere we were console logging last time, we can jump back in there. Whatever feels good.
Yeah, let's go into this. Is what we were this is the component we were looking at, I think yesterday, or not yesterday, Friday. So yeah, so here's our component. So we just add a console log, or how do we display?
So first, let's import it at the top. So import debug from debug.
Okay. Import debug from debug. There you go. Excellent.
Yep. All right, so now debug that you've just imported is a factory. So it is a function that will return you a function. So in this case, debug is going to generate loggers for you. So you can have various different types of loggers. And I could kind of work through how we typically do that so it's easy to debug. So in this case, let's make a logger inside of the workshop date form component. So const, whatever local variable name you want to call it, log is a good one.
Log.
Equal to debug, and it takes a string. So in most cases, you want this to be normalized across your entire project. So you're not coming up with a kind of random structure for your names, but for the sake of this, let's go ahead and name it workshop date form.
Now, would we do? Is it commonly could we do spaces, or should we keep it all kind of like a variable syntax? What would you...
I think the one that I try to follow is dasherized, or not dasherized. It would be colon delimited. It really doesn't matter. It just needs to not have. So think of like a command line for Linux. You can't have like spaces in there without escaping them. So try to avoid special characters.
Okay.
So in this case, workshop date, perfect. And then, so now we have a log function to actually log out information into the console. So let's scroll down to maybe where we're getting actual data from the query.
All right.
Somewhere we do like a data check a bit further down, probably.
Right here is... I guess anywhere below here. So anywhere we want to check for data. So let's say we just want to print out any data, any of the data that we get in.
Okay. All right. So log data.
So just log.
Pretty simple. Just log. Call it with whatever you want to log. So it basically takes the same arguments that console log would here. So you could have a label with data or just data itself. It could be an object. It could be n number of things, but it's all supported by console log.
Excellent. All right. Now we just got to wait for everything to transpile.
Yes.
We can probably speed this up a little bit by doing, starting up the dev server separately.
And let's open up DevTools.
Open up DevTools, check the console. So it should log out if we're in here, maybe?
So by default, debug is a no-op. It's not until you set in this case, because you're in a browser or a client versus node, you need to set a local storage variable. So it's local storage debug is the name of it.
Ooh.
And set that equal to a wildcard string that you want to look at. So in our case, it's a string. Let's do, I forget what you called your logger.
Workshop.
Go back and look.
Workshop work dash shop dash date.
So just to show the power of the wildcards, let's do star shop star.
Star shop.
Yep.
Star.
Yep. Hit enter. Refresh your page. You should see some logging now.
Ooh.
And the cool thing about it is that it keeps a nice color-coded key that stays the same throughout the existence of that logger. So if you had one in there with a different key, it would be a different color. So you could look at them with pretty colors because everybody likes colors, but you could easily find that specific one that you're looking for. And it is not immutable, but if you give it the same key, it's going to be the same color, whatever that means. But if you did that across the board, anytime you see a green one, it would give you a visual hint as well as the key. So
Okay.
now if you wanted to, let's add another log in there so we can show that it's only showing that specific wildcard. So let's make any other log really.
Logger
Yes.
2, debug.
Let's do let's do it with workshop dash form.
Workshop dash form.
And then let's go down to our render function and put it down there just to show every time it re-renders or something. Yeah.
Logger 2. And then you can say
New date. Anything really, just to show that it's. Yep. Now if you save that, it refreshes, you're going to see the new logs.
oh yeah. And that's because it's doing that. So when we set up the debug, we told it if we're using regex and we're telling it if it has shop anywhere between the logger name, it will print it out.
Anywhere in the log key does it have the 4 characters in a row. Yep. So now if we wanted to limit it to just say the workshop date logger, we would do date as the ending character. I don't know how strict the regex is. I think it's just wildcarded. So if you did that, hit enter, refresh the page, you should only see the date ones.
Ooh.
So what makes it really powerful is in production, you're not taking a performance hit by logging everything, but you can pick and choose and be very specific about what you want to see. So let's say a given component, you've namespaced it with your logger name. So you could say, hey, tell me when this is happening inside of that component. So it encourages you to leave console logs, or in this case, debug logs in your code without removing them. So debugging In the future, for maintainers, can just simply turn on that debug whatever in their local storage variable and magically see all the inner workings of the kind of the workflow of your application.
Okay, this is really cool. I am actually going to be using this because no, I don't want to be tracked. I'm actually going to use this because I actually, in one of the applications I have to explicitly remove console logs because when I submit it for reviews into the store, they don't want logging in there. So this is the workaround.
Well, yeah, there you go. I mean, and it's JavaScript, so if it's a React app, wherever your dev tools live, as long as you have access to local storage, you should be able to enable or disable it at any time you want. Another cool thing about it is, let's say you have a very generic name for your key, your logging key. You can restrict it as well. So how we had it set to like star date inside of the DevTools.
Yeah.
We can add negative pieces to that. So if you said star date, comma, minus shop, I guess, is that a good one? It would basically say, give me everything that has star date and remove anything that matches -shop.
Oh, okay. So let's see. If we did,
You could do workshop again or just
yeah,
shop.
we can do
So
work. Let's do work. So we're going to look for we're asking for anything that starts with work, and then
Yep.
we're going to say if it comes with shop, then we're going to say no. Well, actually, let's see what this does first.
it's only ending, yeah. So this will
So
give you everything back. Should.
this will give us everything. So we get both workshop date and workshop form. And now we're going to say, nope, I don't want, if it has shop in it, I don't want it. Like that.
Well, that'll exclude everything. Well, that says remove anything that ends with, or in this case, starts with shop, which it doesn't. So you need to throw in a wildcard if you want it to.
All right, let's
End
get
or start.
rid of form. We don't want form.
Okay. I think that may return everything still. We'll see. You may have to wildcard it.
Okay, it does. We're learning. So
Yep.
wildcard that like this. Oop, what the heck? Why am... There we go.
Just wrap it in stars. Well, I guess it's ending. Never mind. That's fine. That'll work.
Okay.
I should only see once. Yep.
Okay, that's really cool.
So
Wow.
it gives you a nice tool to do it without having to remove all your logging. Because what I found over time is that when you're debugging something, there's a good chance you're going to come back in there at some point in the future and debug it the exact same way. So why not leave it in there with a logical key that you could dive into if you have a production failure, in staging or dev or whatever it may be.
Yeah.
It just makes sense to leave it in there. Plus you get around some deployment issues with your app into the store apparently too. So there you go. Winning.
So Nate, you mean actually leave these debug statements in your code, and then in all your different environments, staging, production, you can look at it live and see these debug statements that would normally only be available to you in your dev mode?
Correct.
That's correct. Obviously,
That's
you don't want to be, well, anything that you're logging in the client is free domain anyway, so I guess I wouldn't go about logging all of the things, but for the most part, it does a really good job of allowing you to focus in on a specific piece of functionality without having to worry about the performance impacts.
I could see if you're like doing any data manipulation or like a network request that you repeat, you could build a function that has this debugger built in, right?
Exactly.
And then anytime you reuse that code, you'll have that debugging available.
Yeah, some really nice things that I've noticed with a node environment is that if I say debug star, like everything, there are other libraries that I'm using that are leveraging it. So I can dive down into their code and see their debug messages as well. So it allows you to have that even deeper sense of what's going on. So it helps you troubleshoot third-party packages without any extra overhead.
That's pretty cool.
That's very cool.
There you go. Enjoy.
Boom. I'm bookmarking this.
Nate, blowing minds every day.
All right, I bookmarked that. I'm using it for later.
Awesome.
All right.
And on the nodes side, just some background too. It's built on top of the native debug utility that comes from core, so it's not adding any extra code really, other than colorizing your labeling. Whereas on the front end, it has a bit more, but the back end, when you're working in Node, it doesn't add any overhead to your file size.
Cool. All right, and I threw that link into the chat. Anyone else gets curious later on, they can click that. Thank you, Nate. Anyone else have any good JavaScript tips that they'd like to share?
Yeah, I think I have a couple I could share. I kind of build on where we're going with this. One that I find useful is if I'm working in a component and I might have a couple ways of maybe going through iterating a list, and it might be expensive. I might want to see like how fast it takes. And so I've used console.time, and it's a helpful mechanism for gauging the performance of your code. And I thought we could try to see how long it takes to get the data here. If you wanted to go back into the code right where you're doing that use query, we can throw in, right, let's see, right there in line, yeah, like on line 52, if you did a console.time and you gave it some sort of name, it could be whatever, maybe like query, that works too. Escape the double quotes or escape. Whew, that was close. Okay, so this won't actually do anything until you say, hey, I'm done. So what we'd probably want to do is say console.time ends with that same key. But maybe we could do that in like after line 60,
okay,
when we actually have something, right after set status.
Oh yeah, because we get the data coming in. Actually,
Yep.
Let's see. Yeah, that'll be good. Console dot time.
Time, and then it's time end with a capital E.
Time end. Okay. Time end. Oh yeah, there you go.
Yep.
And then we pass in your timer.
Same key. Yep. And then that shows up in the console, in your front end there on a refresh.
Okay. Hold on. Let's.
So yeah, we had a.
There we go.
Yeah, it's not great because we have a few renders in here, but you can see it. There you go, 414 milliseconds. So, this is a very contrived scenario. So that's, you can use that wherever in JavaScript, but I find that useful if I'm going between like, one of the things that I really like to see is like, if we're using something like Ramda, how fast is Ramda actually faster than native implementation? So like I might do a map reduce with the native JavaScript, and then I might do it with Ramda and see which one's faster. It's just a quick little like exercise that you can do to choose the faster way of doing something. And so one other quick little tidbit or quick thing that I've never used this, and I just found out about it. But if we go back to where that console.time end is, and if we add one more under there, and I don't even know what this is going to do. So console.trace, and then just give it like call it, and then you want to give it some name like data or whatever your heart desires. There you go.
Trace data.
Emojis, man.
Oh, emojis. Okay. I'm okay with that. I like that.
Yeah, we're good. We got the character set. Let's do it.
There you
go. Nice.
Okay. I'm ready for this.
Let's see what it does. There we go. So this is again not a very useful demonstration of this, but you can actually see the stack trace. And so say you had a whole bunch of functions you're calling. You could, in one of those functions, call console.trace and say maybe you're using some patterns where you might use different functions depending that had branching in it. You don't know what the actual functions were called. You could use this to trace back to see what was called. And so, you get these in your standard errors, but, I haven't actually used this in any of my code, but it's good to know about. I'm going to keep it in my back pocket. I might use it, but it gives you the stack trace, which is pretty neat.
I think this might be pretty good in terms of like kind of like a teaching scenario, like when you want to visualize how, for instance, how React works, right? You could see how everything's rendering through. Maybe if there's some additional functions firing off that finally gets that point, you can easily just visualize it versus trying to show them stepping through the code.
Yeah, exactly. It gives you some reflection on exactly what got you to this point, which is pretty cool. Just to be able to see it. And so, yeah, that I had one other, a couple other little things, just things that I find useful. So if we pop over to sources, and if we look, let's pop open assets. Nope, Pax.js. There we go. Man, so
actually, maybe it's under Webpacks.
Where's all our dependencies?
Somewhere in here. Here we go. App, JavaScript,
Let's find
pages. It's under the
nasty
Webpacks.
dependencies. You have any jQuery in here?
I don't think so. I think we
Easy.
purposely got rid of jQuery.
I think Rails, as of a recent version, finally dropped jQuery as a dependency.
Well, okay. So say you have this. You're trying to track down an issue, and you keep stepping into like jQuery. You can use something called blackboxing, and so you can right-click any of the JavaScript files in the source tree, and then add it to. You can blackbox it. Which means that the debugger will ignore it.
Okay.
So if you were to, I think you actually have to, I don't know. I think this is like the Webpack. Yeah, this is the Webpack files. If you were to go into your top local, like location and assets. Oh, that's where that was.
That might be the compiled CSS. The pack/js would be the JavaScript file, I think.
Can't see those.
These are these are the JavaScripts right here.
No, you can't black box CSS. Yeah, so I think maybe if you right click one of those guys, yeah. Well, I don't know. Interesting.
But to your point, it is quite useful when like you have a jQuery or a Lambda or Lodash or whatever, and you know that you don't want to dive into that code because one, it's obfuscated and minified and uglified. So you don't, even if you wanted to dive into it, you're not going to care. You just want to watch your code. So when you black box it, it'll skip over like Mati is saying. And all the magic of not hitting F5 and not clicking buttons to step through it just happens, which is awesome.
Yep.
Oh, it looks like it's a setting. At least in this instruction right here. It's in the settings panel, and then you explicitly exclude. I guess I have to activate it. That's why. Maybe it's not activated yet, but.
Well, it's available in Chrome and Firefox. It's just good to know about. If you have a ton of JavaScript dependencies that and you oftentimes end up kind of stepping into those and you don't want to, you can black box those. And in the on that topic of kind of debugging, another thing that I found super helpful, I do this pretty often actually, especially when I'm trying to figure out if I'm iterating through a lot of things. If you were to right click or say you wanted to add a breakpoint in home.js on line 9, right? You would just click line 9, right? That would add a breakpoint. If you were to right click and select add conditional breakpoint, edit breakpoint, because you already have a breakpoint there. So add conditional breakpoint. This is where you can pass an expression. So say if you're looping over objects in your object's obj, you might say like obj.id triple equals 1. And so that would break when you hit the object with ID 1. And rather than, actually adding a debugger in your code and then like hitting continue, 100 times or until the one that you want to get, you can do that conditionally. And I find that to be a little bit more effective, when it warrants that.
That's awesome. That's something that I do frequently in JavaScript. Is if I'm if I'm trying to debug a loop, I'll just put if ID equals this debugger or console log in my code. So it's cool to see that you can do that without having to change your code.
Yeah.
There he is. Where'd it go? That was weird. Conditional breakpoint, locations. I want to see this work. Locations greater than 0. There we go. So if I go to locations, try to refresh. Okay, well, I'm probably not debugging the right spot. Okay, there we go.
That's not a conditional breakpoint, though.
Yeah, that is not.
I think you cleared your conditional breakpoint and added a.
You could do that online. Oh, no. Yeah, that should work.
Yeah. I didn't do dot length. That's probably what happened. Okay, and we only hit
there
it.
you go.
See, I did that on purpose to show what happens when you don't use it, and then when you do use it, calculated. Look, we didn't have to like break on the time when locations was empty. Purely scripted.
That's fantastic.
Yeah. Save some time.
All right.
It's nice.
That's really cool. Nice.
Yeah, and one last tiny little thing, and I don't know if we mentioned this or not, but and I don't know if Firefox has this, but in Chrome, if you go to the Elements tab and continue, actually, I guess it doesn't even matter, but and say you were to inspect, okay, so you had main selected and you go back to console, well, let's say, can you click another, can you inspect like Eric Guzman on that page? Who is Eric Guzman? There you go. Okay, and down in your console, if you do $0, that gives you what you last inspected. And Chrome will keep track of the last 5 things that you inspected. So if you're going and kind of tracing through your UI and hitting a few DOM nodes, they are available in your console as $0, which is your first one. It's 0 based. And then $1, which was main, which was the first one, or I guess you just selected that one. Yeah. So that's another little, just save some time. You don't have to go and requery it. It's there available for you to play with in the console, which is nice. Yeah,
I actually use this pretty heavily when I'm inspecting stuff and want to see values in the console. Is everyone else familiar with this technique also? Out of curiosity?
Yes, as well as with React, I think is a $R or something gives you the last React component you run. If you're in the
if you're on the
DevTools.
The DevTools. Yeah, I didn't know about that one. If we were to like look at something. Oh yeah. Wow. Okay.
Awesome sauce.
Very awesome. Okay. Yeah, I use the $0 pretty heavily. I think $0 just works regardless of what you select too. So if I select this div, I think $0. Yeah. So you don't actually have to inspect it. You just can click on it once you're open once you have this open in the elements. Nice. All right. Are you guys ready to switch over to some Rails stuff?
I
Debugging
am.
strategy?
Yeah, I'm good with that. And if we have time, I have a couple other JavaScript nuggets that Mati kind of pulled the light on or turned the light on for me. So
Cool.
go ahead, Chris, take it away.
Awesome. I sent Eric a couple of patches for this that are kind of they're definitely fake contrived examples, but I wanted to dig into them.
Let's do it. All right. So should I load? Hold on. Let me reset all the stuff we just did. Okay. And you want me to load patch 1 in?
Yes, please.
Let's do it.
It's a git diff, so git apply should work. Yeah.
Yep. I was ready. I was ready for this.
Oh, good preparation. So what I want to specifically talk about is the Ruby stack trace. One thing that I used to do, and I've noticed in a lot of newer programmers that I've worked with, is when you have an exception in Rails, your Rails server is going to print out a stack trace, and every newer developer that I've worked with will see that stack trace and then immediately flip back to their code because that's a bad thing, and I want to see what I did wrong, so I need to look at my code, which I don't think is right. I think that the stack trace is trying to tell you what's wrong, and it's worth a look. So let's look at stack traces.
Let's do it. All right. So we have a bug in our code somewhere.
That's right. And if you go back to that create workshop date or the add a booking interface and try to save, you'll need to keep your Chrome inspector open since this is a GraphQL based request.
Okay. And let's try to create a date. 2.
There we go.
And we have an error.
That's right. That's right. So that's the JavaScript stack trace. There's also a corresponding Ruby stack trace since it was a 500 error. You could see that from the network tab, but also your Rails server output will have that stack trace.
Ooh, that's a lot of scary code, Chris. What's going on?
I know, right? Like, I think that it does a bad job of being friendly looking, right? The number one way to make it friendly looking, which you're already thinking of, is to make your window wider. That's not so bad. And so stack traces, the most useful information in a stack trace is on top.
Okay.
And so that's a frequent mistake that I see people make is they're looking at the bottom where it's like the top is like where the error occurs, and then everything else is all of the function calls that led up to it, which is usually like going to be a bunch of stuff related to your frameworks. Like, there's a ton of stuff from GraphQL, then there's a ton of stuff from all the Rails libraries like Rack and Active Support, etc. And so that's not actually where your error is occurring. Your error is occurring at the top, and the exception we see is wrong number of arguments given 0, expected 1.
Yep.
And the following line is exactly the line of code where this error occurred.
Okay. So we have an issue in our app, GraphQL mutations, create workshop date, line 24. Okay. So let's try to dive.
Quick question. Can you command click that in the terminal and go directly to that file on that line?
Yes, we can.
Fantastic.
So that trick only works if you set a default. It chooses whatever editor the file is default to open, I believe. So I have Visual Studio Code.
Right.
That's my default editor. So when you double click a file, it opens up VS Code. So if I command click this file, it should open up VS Code too. Also, I believe that's the way it works. All right, Chris.
All right. So we have a wrong number of arguments given 0, expected 1 exception. It looks like the 2 lines of code that are our code are line 24 and line 10. So let's analyze that.
Okay. So then you said that it starts from beginning and then the end where we get to the errors at the top. So
that's right. The top is the line of code where the error occurred.
Okay, so that says line 24.
Right.
Okay.
And so line 24 is actually the method definition, not an actual executable line of code. And the exception I'm seeing is kind of connected to that, right? We have a wrong number of arguments means that a function takes a certain number of arguments, and we have failed to pass that number of arguments to it. Looks like process location ID, an entirely fake and useless function that I made up, takes one argument. And then when we invoke it on line 10.
Okay, so we're kind of like backtracing. It's like, okay, we found this found this spot right here. This is the error. There's nothing obvious going on here, so we start to go backwards. We start to backtrace,
backtrace the stack trace.
Go to 10.
I like it.
And this is where we're using it.
That's right. That's right. So we can see that we're invoking the process location ID method. For you JavaScript folks in Ruby, if you have a method and you don't give it, parentheses, it will invoke that method, which is unlike JavaScript. So that is essentially invoking that method with 0 arguments. So if you were to correct that and invoke it with an argument.
Let's see. So let's see. The intended use of this function is to pass in the location ID. In the resolver, we get location ID here. Let's go ahead and toss it in there. Okay. So refresh. And this. Oh wait, this is like a JavaScript error.
That's a JavaScript error. Blame the JavaScript developer for that one.
Although it did create it.
That's right.
Let us ignore that. But it created it. It worked. Awesome.
Definitely.
So that is, so when we get errors in even in our JavaScript, because we actually, Mati was a good segue into this, is like he showed the trace. So that gave us a stack. But when we get errors, we always get stack traces. So the lesson you're trying to teach here is that if you see the stack trace, don't immediately just go, oh, an error. Don't treat as a signal of just error and then look at your code and trying to figure out what happened. You're saying one of the first things you should probably try to do is look at the stack trace first before jumping to the code?
Exactly. It's like a murder mystery where you see a person with a knife in their back and you leave the table before the person next to them is like, I did it.
Okay. Gotcha. All right. So understand, don't leave the table. Don't leave the crime scene before you start doing the investigation. Look at all the facts. And your crime scene is your stack trace.
Exactly.
Dr. Agras.
Exactly. I think the temptation is to go back and look at your code because it's probably something in your code that you did, and so it's not a bad place to be looking. But you're just discarding a lot of information that could be helpful to you.
Gotcha. I think Dr. Agras agrees with your example. He's saying, all right. All right. So onto stack trace, or onto the next lesson in our little adventure.
Yeah.
All right.
A very similar exercise, but it's a little obfuscated.
Okay. So should I reset what I was doing with this work and then dive into the next patch?
Yeah.
Okay. By the way, what I'm doing here, if everyone's wondering what the heck I'm doing git checkout -- space dot, and that resets all the current work that's happening inside this branch with the previous commit. So I just have it abbreviated to GCO. All right, so get that. Okay, we have a new patch in. Now let's close our.
All right.
I'm gonna close my file.
That's right.
Yeah.
Same process, please.
All right. All right, now I'm saving. Oh,
Very similar error on our front end. Now let's look at our Rails stack trace.
okay. So we have our stack trace nice and wide, just to make it easier to read. That's the first step. And then we got to scroll to the top to see where it actually did the error.
That's right. And it's a Rails related exception saying unknown attribute bananas for workshop date. But this example is very different because at the top of our stack trace is actually not our code. It's actually a bunch of active model code, which is Rails's library for handling saving data and saving models. And so this is another thing that I see people get tripped up by is exceptions could occur because we've set something up, passed it over to one of our open source libraries, and then later on when the open source library tries to act on it, in this case active record trying to save a model with invalid data in it, it's running into an exception at that point. And so we're a little bit separated from where our actual problem is.
Yeah, because when I'm looking at this, I'm like, what the heck is RBEM and then gems active model? I didn't write any of this code. What the heck? This isn't me.
Right. None of that is our project directory. No, that's our code. That's the actual open source libraries. One thing that's really cool is that like npm and yarn, RubyGems actually downloads the source code of all of your open source to your computer. So if you wanted to check out and look around inside of active record code, you could actually command click any of those and open up the open source for Rails and poke around and look at it. But Ruby on Rails is a 20-year-old framework that has tens of thousands of open source contributors. So if we're looking for a perpetrator of a code crime, it's likely ourselves and not the framework itself. So the next thing I would do in this scenario would be to look down that stack trace for a line of code that does exist in our project.
Okay. So let's start from the top and keep on going down. All stuff I do not recognize. It's like active record, active model. But then I get to this line right here. And I do recognize this. This is in my app, in my GraphQL.
Yep. And so that was the invoker of this other open source, right? So that line is what caused all this other active record stuff to trigger and act and then have an exception. So that's the last line of our code that we could look at. So let's look at it.
All right. So command click in. All right. So that took us to line 10 for our cursor. Very nice. And let me shift this over so it doesn't block, cameras don't block it. And so now we're just looking at this code. I guess the error says unknown attributes bananas.
Yep. So following the tradition of our great friend Kevin, I have thrown the words monkeys and bananas in places where they don't belong. So active record is attempting to save an object that has attributes that don't actually exist on our database table, and that's what's causing that exception. This is actually something that I see kind of frequently, where if you're building out new functionality in Rails and you are taking a hash of all this data and cramming it into model.new, you're telling Rails that I want to save a version of that model that has all of these attributes, and you might be reading params off of a Rails controller, and params in a Rails controller could have any input. You hope that your users are only filling out form fields that you actually put on the page, but they could be sending any arbitrary data to your Rails controller theoretically. And so this pattern of doing workshop date.new and then just passing the params hash won't work in Rails 5 Plus because they've added some security protections against it. But in various places where you might be taking an arbitrary collection of data and passing it to workshop date or whatever model.new, could lead to this error. So it's an error that I've recently seen in a real project.
Gotcha.
Not with bananas.
But with monkeys.
Perhaps with monkeys.
So now that we've kind of dove into this, we've identified that, yeah, bananas might not be an attribute that we want or that is on the model.
That's right.
What would be a good way to know that bananas is actually not on our active record model?
If I saw an error like unknown attribute for X model, I would probably look at the database schema to see what the actual schema of this Rails model was supposed to be.
So if I went to database, schema, and we're looking at workshop dates.
Yeah. This is Rails's Ruby representation of your database. A very handy place to look if you want to see what actual fields are available on your active record models. We can see the standard created at and updated at, which are included in all Rails models by default. We have a field called date, and we have a field called location ID. We do not have a field called bananas.
No bananas.
No bananas.
So it's not a case that we accidentally misspelled bananas. It's not banana. There's no bananas, period. So,
That's right.
So the solution to this is to actually, it's not a user error of some side of typo or something like that. It's actually, we don't want bananas, period.
That's right. That's right. Maybe you wanted a field called bananas, but you hadn't quite gotten to adding that to your database table, or you just have a random banana adder, and you just need to get rid of that.
Yeah. Really sucks when you have one of those.
That's right.
All right. Let's refresh. And save. It will ignore that. But it created a new date on February 21st. No error, stack trace, or anything like that.
That's right. That's right. We figured it out.
Woo! We got the bananas out of our code. Nice. Well,
Very
thank
nice.
you.
Yeah. I just wanted to share that because, like I said, the stack trace is super useful, and if you're not afraid to look at it, it can usually tell you at least roughly where your problem is.
It helps you point the finger.
That's
right.
That
transcends well across all languages, I think. Even some of the JavaScript, and especially in React, the stacks are very tall. And if you just see the wall of text and get lost in it and you don't read the top, you can fall into the same pitfalls. So that's a very good point, Chris.
That's right. The most frequent mistake is just not looking at the top of the stack trace. The bottom of the stack trace is probably the least useful part because it's probably like web framework X start or something like that. Whereas the actual code that caused the exception is going to be at the top of the stack trace. And
that's almost every modern language. I think every modern language follows the same rules with the stack trace. So this technique, going to the top of the stack trace that you see, applies to virtually every programming language you'll touch. If you decide to dabble in another one like Go or Elixir, I would imagine. Cool. Nice. All right. Nate, you had more to share. Unless anyone has any other questions about Rails or debugging or anything like that, or any additional anecdotes. Curious to hear what else Nate has, or Mati has in store.
Just general debugging tidbits. So some of them are JavaScript related. Some are just being able to use DevTools. Like DevTools is a extremely useful, when put in the right hands, tool. Sometimes because of all the tabs, it's very scary to get into initially. So starting out, I spent most of my time in console and elements. Long before React, those were the two things that I spent all my time. I liked console because it was a cheap REPL for me to run JavaScript, and elements because I'm constantly tweaking CSS and DOM to get it to display correctly. So that's not uncommon for someone starting out. So for me, there's a really neat thing to do with the Elements tab that I've seen even the most experienced developers doing things maybe inefficient, not necessarily the wrong way, but inefficiently. So if we wanted to change the CSS that renders the dates, so if you inspected February 7th, 2020, just click on that guy. Now I've seen a lot of experienced developers do this. They go to their VS Code, they change some CSS in there, wait for Webpack to spin up, re-render the page, and show this again. That's generally okay if you're starting out, like you're prototyping it and you're still in the very early development phase. But if you're just looking to change, let's say, the size or the color, do it in your dev tools first. It's very cheap and the feedback loop is immediate. So in this instance, we want to change all of the headings to 4 rem or whatever. The font weight now is 700. Let's make it normal font weight. Let's do that. So over on the right, in the, not the element guy, but down in that class, the dot heading, yep, change the font weight to normal. So you just click on it and it gives you a nice autocomplete. You set it to normal. Let's say we want to add a color, like change the color to pink or something more glamorous. Pink.
I was going to suggest pink.
Yep, pink. Okay, so change it. So just click on the end of padding there, double click on it, and it should give you a new line to add a new attribute.
I clicked too hard, sorry.
It was a very angry click. So color and then set it to pink because it's festive.
Oh my god.
All right, so now we've done that.
4 different pinks, though.
Hot pink. Clearly, that's the only pink,
pink.
you're choosing.
I agree.
It's a better contrast ratio.
Yeah. All right, so we've changed it. All right, we like that. So like people that are very detail oriented would take those two things because they like it, go apply it to their code now, their CSS code and VS Code. Let's say you want to keep playing with it. Say we want to change where it says day of workshops. Let's go change that guy now. So click on the H3 that's right above it there in the DOM, and let's change the label of that to, maybe the size isn't large enough. Let's make it 2 rem.
So, whoop. 2 rem?
Right. Yep. So now it's 2 rem. So, all right, we like this, but maybe we want to go back and undo what we've done and then move forward with another change. You can hit Command Z right now, and it'll undo all of the CSS changes as you walk through them. So just like any other undo, Command Z will undo it. So it'll even undo the pink on the date as you continue to hit. So that is something that I learned over time. Like, hey, you can just Command Z all the things that you've done. So it gives, and you can also step back forward with Command Shift Z, and it'll step back through them, just like, undo and redo. So that's the handy little tidbit.
I've been using this interface for like half a decade and didn't know that.
Yes, I'm full of gems. I've got more.
The one thing I like about, so I do this heavily because I'm horrible at CSS, so this gives me a playground without having to refresh. One thing I really enjoy about this interface here is you can highlight this whole thing, copy it,
yep,
and if you paste it, it's exactly the same format.
Yep.
So
it is awesome. And you could even, like, if you comment or the uncheck in the DevTools, it'll paste in there as commented out CSS, which is really cool.
Ooh. If I do this.
Yep.
Okay. Cool.
Yep. Nifty stuff. All right, so one thing that I noticed here that I wasn't planning on showing, but so font size, we wanted to adjust that slightly, and you had, I think, maybe pushed up arrow or down arrow, and it went up and down by a whole number.
Yeah.
If you hold down Option and push down, I think.
Let me see. Let me go undo to, there we go. Option, push down. Oh.
Does decimal places. And I think there's even a shift option that'll do 1/100ths, or
So it'd
one
be
of those.
Option on Mac, Alt on Windows.
So if you want to just do a tiny tweak versus a whole number, that's how you would do it, using it with just the arrow keys and Option and any combination of other things.
Nice. Okay, I'm going to use that.
So now on to one. We'll come back to some DevTool things, but I have one for React, like data in general. When I have a list, for instance, a list of workshops, oftentimes I forget, or I want to inspect what that shape of data is that I get back. And rather than inspecting the network tab and then diving into all the data that's deeply nested, I'll go into my React component and use a pre-tag. And this one may or may not be new to most of you, but is like incredibly useful when you're developing, starting out, like trying to figure out what attributes are actually available on the data that I'm getting in. So if we went into wherever we're iterating over these workshops, I can show you the power of that.
All right, let's go find that in our app, JavaScript, components. That location. Actually,
Perhaps we could use the React component inspector to find out which component.
There you go.
workshop date list. Workshop date list.
All right, so if I want to quickly find out what a workshop date is, let's replace the accordion part with just a good old-fashioned pre-tag.
Pre-tag.
Yep. And in there, we're going to just do curly braces. And in there, JSON.stringify workshop date. And comma, null, comma 2. The comma null, I forget what it's doing. It's like replacing pieces of your JavaScript. And the third argument is how many spaces you want to format your JavaScript.
Hold
on. Oh no.
There you go.
It may have to be a function. Sure. We'll find out. So there you go. Like, quick and dirty way to figure out what your data shape looks like.
Okay.
So when I start out like a brand new component on a brand new model, I want to make sure I'm getting back what I expect. I'll just JSON stringify with the pre-tag, and there you go. Obviously, that's just a debug, like early development thing, but it's even coming into an older code base, you look at it and like, I don't know what the data shape is. You can easily just pre-tag it, and there you go.
That's definitely another common mistake I see among developers that are getting used to things is making assumptions about the shapes of data and what a particular like variable's value is at a certain time. A lot of times, like some people will see nil errors, which is a common thing in both Ruby and JavaScript, and not really know what that is. And I think that tools like this, seeing the shape of data and getting used to the process of like adding debuggers and looking at the data as it's flowing through your code is really important.
Yeah, never assume that you know what the data shape is when you finally get it down to where you're displaying it. Like, even if you fully trust that you have your models and types in the right shape, just output it before you go crazy.
Yeah, that brings up a good point. That logging for the sake of logging just to see stuff helps only part of the way. A common thing is you should understand what how your code is behaving. You can to infer more about why things are going wrong. To your point, Chris, I threw in a console log for the data right here. just to console log what data is. And we can see right here that, let me get rid of that. The very first log was undefined. To a new developer, that this looks a little weird. It's like, wait, why is it data undefined? I am doing a request here for data. It should return back some data, and I should, it should be there. But I'm getting undefined the first time, but then it has stuff in there.
And you would get nil errors if you attempted to do like data.id or data if workshop dates sounds like an array. And so if you attempted to do like data square braces 0 to get the first element of that, you might see an error.
Yeah, like this. Not guarding against whether we're loading. We're just doing a straight data workshop dates, and we got an error because we're not double checking for the data.
Yeah, being able to read that particular error, that type error, being one of the most common errors in dynamic programming at all, like Ruby and JavaScript, is important to recognize. Like, it can't read the property workshop dates of undefined. When I see that error, haven't gotten used to these errors, I know that I'm doing something .workshop dates, assuming that something has a value, instead of like I'm making the bad assumption that something has a value. So when I do something .workshop dates and it's undefined, that will cause an exception. The exact same thing will happen with the nil error in Ruby.
Yeah, and then if we look at our stack trace again, we can see our issue is at the top of the stack trace on line 29, a workshop date list. Right.
Should be able to click on that line as well.
Well, it takes us to there, but yeah.
Oh, should take you further than that.
But it fails there, and we get that console log, so you can use the stack trace. The thing that new developers and people in general is, don't make assumptions about your code. Double check, especially if you're not sure how something works. Don't assume this. If you're unfamiliar with the use query, don't assume that it's just going to do what you think it's going to do. Go and Google it. Go look it up on your favorite search engine. Look up what use query does. Find out how it behaves. Don't assume how it behaves and think that something else is wrong in your code. Double check that. Check your assumptions of any library you're using. Is you're either using it as it's intended or it's behaving as it's intended before you start to move code around to try to fix a bug that is not a bug from the perspective of the library, but more of a, in this case, data not being passed in right away.
Yeah, I see a lot of new developers race to try to fix bugs. Like they'll see an error like that, and they'll be like, well, they'll come up with a dozen things to try before really looking at what like the stack trace is, or thinking critically about why we might be getting that error, or understanding like what that use query function is doing. And so I would just encourage everyone, if you're having trouble debugging, it could be because you're going too fast, you're trying too hard, perhaps. And if you kind of rewind it and say what information is available, like in my stack trace, in the documentation, can help me out. That tends to help me out a lot when I have these problems.
One thing that I'd like to touch on, and it's sometimes like when you're trying to troubleshoot an issue, it's not so straightforward. It's not something that you can just look at the stack trace and find. It could be performance related. And we could probably spend a lot of time here. I'm by no means an expert, but I think it would be worth mentioning the profile, the Yak Profiler. And it's similar. It's in your DevTools there. And if you click the chevrons there and you click Profiler, it's another little tool that comes with React DevTools. for Chrome and Firefox. And this gives you a look as to how your components render. And so it gives you, what I've used the most is the flame graph, but the ranked is kind of a nice, easy way to see who are the heavy hitters in your app. And to make use of this, you'd click that little blue dot to start profiling. And then once you do that, go ahead and just refresh the page. Oh, or maybe that doesn't do that. Oh yeah, so yeah, reload and start profiling. There we go. And maybe click add a workshop date and add a new workshop date in there. And of course, we're rendering pre-tags, so that it's okay. Go ahead and stop profiling. And so this gives you a whole bunch of stuff. And so what this does is it breaks down all your components by commit. And this isn't a git commit. It's essentially when React's putting stuff or taking it out of the actual physical DOM. So that's the commit phase. And that's reflected with like component did mount or component will update. And so this kind of gives you a quick view as to how long it takes certain components to render. And if you just click the ranked tab, that one might be a little bit easier to just kind of see who's the culprit. Like workshop date list is, what we're looking at. So that's expected. It's taken 13.6 milliseconds to run. So you could click that, I think, to drill in more. And maybe that's just on the flame graph. Yeah, if you go back to the flame graph and we find workshop date list, should be down at the, there you go. Can you click in? It's just because we have those pre-tags in there. It's not rendering anything else, but typically you can drill in a little bit more. It's okay. So yeah, if we redo that with some actual components in there.
All right. And stop it.
Go. Yep. And so yeah, similar output. We don't have too many components on here, honestly. And what I've been able to do with this is, especially if you have like a list of data that has like a composition of 10 components per item. One of those components might make some HTTP request and do something asynchronously that causes it to re-render like 20 times. And each one of those renders are really expensive. And those will show up as red. And so we don't have much red on here. But at a glance, as you're working through your app, you can use this for just like baselining what you're working on. So if you're starting on working on a new screen, run through your flame graph, see how it looks. You could print it or save it off. I'm pretty sure you can so you can export these. You can import them. If you really want to get crazy, you could save them or save the profiles that you ran. And then say you're working on a new feature, you go spend 2 weeks, 3 weeks adding your new feature, run through the same exercise, compare the two flame graphs. You can probably do a lot more with it. I am pretty novice with this. I used it to diagnose performance issues before and found it super helpful. Something that I would love to learn a lot more and get better at using. And I just wanted to make note of it. It's pretty handy for especially catching like something that you might want to memoize, like a component that does like 200 renders when maybe it could just do 2.
Yeah,
those are some big wins.
A couple of years ago, I was working on a client, and we had an interface that was essentially, it was a new interface. It displayed a lot of data, and when you loaded the screen, it would just crash your browser because the performance was so bad. And using we actually used the performance tab in Chrome at the time because this new interface on the React Profiler hadn't come out yet. But being able to, like, this super dense with information, and you don't necessarily have to understand everything you're looking at. But if you are able to like either use a ranked view or see the same component getting rendered over and over again, in the case of this particular client, they had like a system for loading data that would change their state tree, their Redux state tree, every time a single object was loaded. And so that means instead of like downloading all the data and re-rendering everything once, it would download all the data and re-render everything for every individual object that was inside of that state tree. And that pattern, we were able to see that pattern inside this profiler because we saw the same component getting re-rendered hundreds and hundreds of times when we were trying to load that page. And so we were able to do some memoization of how that component got rendered, and it got the performance from crash your browser bad to just regular slow.
Acceptable slow.
Acceptable slow.
Yeah. I recently used this when diagnosing. It was an infinite scroll list. You'd scroll through it and it would load items. It was rendering each item when it picked up the new page like 100 times. And so, there's 4 items, there's 400 renders for 4 items. It's like, that's obviously bad.
Yeah.
So, and you don't know that. Like, if you're just looking at your React app, you won't know that. Another quick, dirty way to do that without using this is just do a console log and render, and just see how many times that comes out. That's a quick little way. Yeah, that sometimes I'll be like, I wonder if like something is making this render funny. Like maybe I didn't add something in a use effect, or I'm using a hook that I'm not sure how it works. Just console logging in your render kit is a quick way to see how many times your component's actually rendering to. But this is probably a more efficient way to diagnose like performance issues.
Yeah, actually, so while you were talking, I was playing around with it, and we were looking at the first render of workshop date list, but in this list, we can look at the other renders and see what's happening.
Does the React Dev tool still have the highlight updates feature?
Yes, it does. If we highlight that, we should be able to see this thing turn into a Christmas tree.
Perhaps if you added another workshop date. There you go. There was a very brief green highlight around that.
Oh, yep.
There we go. That's kind of cool. So that's a pretty. If you have some sort of inefficient rendering problem, like you have some kind of like network request that's loading in data and causing a bunch of re-renders, or you have a hook that's misconfigured and is like looping or polling and causing a re-render. You could use that feature to kind of see it blink as it's re-rendering when you don't think it's re-rendering necessarily.
Yeah.
Wow. So it like visually shows you, and does it map to the color of the flame graph? So it'd be like orange or red, or is it just how does the?
I think it just blinks. It just shows you when interactions happen. So that highlighted that for a second, like Chris pointed out.
Yeah, if you have like constant looping re-renders happening, your React interface will essentially look like a Christmas tree, where it will just be blinking over and over and over again, and that will be a good indicator that you have some pretty less than ideal performance issues.
Yeah, like we can see right here in this flame graph that it rendered this, and then there's like these other empty nodes here, and then it rendered this again, and it does this whole thing, and then when we got a new record, it re-rendered all of these old ones. So there might be some performance tuning that we can do potentially for these components.
Newer versions of React, though, are actually pretty good about if you have like a list of elements, that if you have like an array of things that you're rendering elements based on, and that array changes, it may not actually be like re-rendering the DOM for those individual elements if it's working the way that they intended to. But it looks like that is actually running the render function for each of those components. But because of the nature of React, as long as your render function doesn't have a lot of work inside of that function, it will not change the DOM itself because it will, do that shadow DOM versus DOM comparison that that kind of drives React's performance.
A quick tip on that: if you don't provide a key, there is no caching for you.
That's true. That's true.
That thing will be rendered every single time. React has no way of being
those
able
pesky
to
warnings about adding a key in your loops are actually important.
It's no joke. Add those keys.
That's a common one that everyone kind of glosses over, is if you see a warning in the console, especially if you're using React and it tells you to do something, please do it. It's for a good reason.
Don't use the array item index. Don't do that. It's just as bad. There's linting around that, so lint away. It's there to help you.
A little callback to our lessons learned from last stream.
Yep.
All right.
I do have 2 more items.
All right. Good. I was about to say that.
I need 2 minutes.
I was about to ask. I'm like, anyone have anything else? Let's keep it going if we got them.
All right. So quick and easy way to interrogate data coming back from whatever API you're hitting. So let's say you're coming into a new project, you're watching the network tab, and you get back this data, which is nice. You can see it there in DevTools, but when you go back to your code, you have to keep going back and forth between your network tab of DevTools and your VS Code to determine what is the actual shape of this. Let's say it's a third-party API. So what I like to do is go into my network tab like I normally would. I click on Preview. So if I want to look at the Preview tab next to Response, and then let's open that. Let's expand it down to workshop dates or whatever it was. And I want to see what one of these looks like. If I right-click on any one of those array keys, so let's say number 1, and right-click and say Store as Global Variable, that will pop up in your DevTools as this permanent object, which is great. Like it gives you an isolated or focused view on it, which is awesome. But it doesn't help you with that VS Code problem where you're going back and forth. So what I like to do is use copy that's built into the DevTools. So copy open paren temp1 close paren, and I could paste it in my VS Code.
So just highlight.
Nope. Just write the word copy, like it's a function built into DevTools.
So just copy.
Yeah.
And
copy open close paren and put temp1 in there, or whatever variable you want to copy. And it'll throw it in your clipboard for you. Now when you go back to VS Code, you can paste it in there and do whatever you want.
there it is.
Like it gives you the JSON formatted in this case, or whatever that object is that you wanted to copy. So it's built right into it, which is pretty nice. Getting backticks because of the new lines.
Yeah. God, no, stop it. Make it
Or
stop. Anyway,
just take the
perfect.
quotes off completely and just paste it in there. But the idea is like, I'm looking at an object that is foreign to my system, so I don't have like a actual model that's around it. This gives you a quick way of doing that. Like I wouldn't go back in and log it out in the console here, but you get the idea. Like you can copy anything out of DevTools using the built-in copy command. That function's always there for you. You can also clear. Cool. Like there's a whole bunch of them built in, but yeah, it's really it helps me out. Like this is a small object here, but when they're really tall and they're hard to read through, like copying them into a global variable, then copy them out, move them over. That makes it really easy.
Now I'm rabbit holing. Okay. So
yeah,
if you copy an element, it'll just do that. Ooh. So calling back Mati's $0 tip combined with copy, we just copied an entire HTML element.
Yep.
Let's go deeper.
Did you know that you can drag and drop and copy elements inside of the element panel?
So
like grab that icon div and move it. Just drag it to wherever you want.
There we go.
Yeah. You can live move around stuff. Might make your DOM, your React DOM angry, but you can do it. You can copy and paste stuff. You can do a whole bunch of things.
There you go. More techniques to fix styles or fix HTML.
Yes. That's all I got, though. Those are my last two things.
I think I like this copy command as it just copied this entire HTML element, like even the children.
Yep.
And the SVG.
All the things.
All the things. All right. Any other tidbits from anyone else?
I'm spent for today. I've got plenty of things, but
one thing that was an interesting book to read, and it was actually a college course at my school. It was 1 credit, but there is a debugging book you can read that can help you become a better debugger. Let's see if I can look it up real quick on the fly. Debugging book. This is it. Debugging. Look it up on Goodreads. Yeah. So this is a very tiny book that teaches you just good best practices for debugging your code. So one of the, and it covers the various things we talked about today. We talked about understanding your code, or understanding what your code is doing. Before you try to do anything, understand how it's supposed to work. Get a full understanding of what's supposed to be coming in, what's supposed to be coming out, all the different libraries that we're using. Get an understanding, pull back, stop looking at the individual line of code, pull back, get a higher look. Another good one that is something that you should always follow is when you're debugging and trying to fix something, do one thing at a time. Do not change a bunch of things and see what happens. Change one thing, check. Change another thing, check. And check what's happening. Because if you get too down in the rabbit hole and you start tinkering with different things and change different values, you've modified the behavior of your code so much that you might have just completely removed the bug, or you caused several other bugs on top of the original bug that it exists. So it's a fun little book to read, lightweight, and good enough for 1 college credit. But it's a good book to read if you just want to get some better understanding on how to debug your code.
Yeah, I would pile on to that last tip and say, take advantage of your version control system too. If you have a pile of problems and you're able to solve one of those, write a Git commit. If you, depending on how you like to collaborate others, you can clean up those commits later using Git rebase and squash. But I found that you don't want to necessarily lose progress by forgetting what you've done and forgetting what progress you've made as you go.
Yeah, that's the one out of everything in this book. That's the one tip I've took to heart. One thing at a time. And this book is good because look, it's a book about debugging, the driest topic, and it's at a 4.22 stars.
Awesome.
All right, I think that's it. That was a lot of good content, everyone. Thank you very much.
I want to put everybody on the spot real quick. Your one quick tidbit. So let's say you watched none of this stream. What's the one debugging thing to level up that you would do or tell others to do if you had the opportunity? Go ahead, Madi. You're first.
Oh, honestly, I think the one thing is to not give up. I had paired with somebody, and it was just this moment that and it was something he said, and it was like I had just given up, and we just figured it out, and we were just like one step away, and he was like, "Yeah, see if you just keep going," and it was just like it was nothing technical. It was just a mental thing, and I think that can make a world of difference. Is don't give up, and Because as soon as you feel like you're about to fail, that is right when you're about to figure it out. So there you go.
Nice. Chris.
Phone a friend. If you are stuck on something, it's likely that you've just been looking at the same thing for too long and you're kind of like just so lost that you might be missing an obvious detail. And so get a friend, get a video conference going, and show them what you're doing, explain what you've tried. And by the time you get done explaining, you'll usually find the problem because you're trying to explain the issue to another person.
Yo, rubber duck.
Yeah, rubber duck, exactly. Yeah.
And then I'll go rolling off Chris's tip. And if you're unfortunate and you don't have any friends, it's also a good strategy to just take a break. Get up, walk around the block, walk around the office, go talk to somebody. Just don't think about the code and then come back to it. Because sometimes, again, you might be so hyper focused that you're not refreshing your mind on what you're you're just stuck. You're stuck in a loop. You're not getting out of it, and sometimes you just need a full refresher. So get up, get out there, get away from the code, and you could come back to the code and just realize, what, I see the bug now. Oh my god, how did I not see that before?
Yeah, it's funny how the brain works. It's like your subconscious mind is able to work on things while you're not aware of them.
Yeah, it's like you put the solution or the problem in a service worker, and it does in the background, and then you come back to it the next day, and it's like, yeah, this is cake. Yeah, breaks are awesome.
And then Lily's in the chat, and she says that she's new to programming. She's been learning. And yeah, she says that, again, Phone a Friend has been a great resource for her. And it usually takes them just a minute or two to help me get back on track. So.
Yep, that's always true. It doesn't matter if you started out or you're 15 years senior. It's always works.
Yeah, it's super helpful when you have another programmer to talk to, but even if it's just another human being who you can explain the problem to, sometimes that's enough.
I don't know how many times it happened to all of us where you start explaining the problem to them and you're like, oh, right. You're just like, now that I'm speaking to, it's the same way in which you're writing at school. You're doing doing an English writing assignment. You're writing an essay, a paper, and then you proofread it and you don't see your own typos. So you need someone else to read your paper to see your typos. Same thing with coding. Sometimes you need someone else to look at your code, or you need to explain it to someone else in order to see your typos, to see what you're doing incorrectly.
And if you don't have somebody else, getting up and walking around is good, but also whiteboarding helps a lot. I find that I get a lot of value out of just whiteboarding, even if it isn't a lot, even if it isn't valuable, it makes you think about it through. And so I think that's a helpful technique as well. But phoning a friend is probably the best way to go about it if you can.
Cool.
Hey.
And I would say my one tidbit is, and I think both Eric and Chris hit on it a little bit, that read the documentation. Like for me, and I hadn't done this for the longest time, I was just overwhelmed with the amount of documentation out there on a certain subject. So I felt like it was too big for me to comprehend. So if you're in that same boat, go out and just read about the method that you're using. Like just read that and know that piece. And then, in your free time or, continued education time, just read through the entire documentation, not to comprehend it all or commit it to memory and use it every day, but it sure helped me out quite a bit as I'm trying to implement new things, and I come across a problem that it just hits a nerve for me that, hey, use this thing over here, even though I haven't used it before. I recall that it's in the documentation. It helps answer that solution or get to that point a lot quicker. So just, if you can't read the whole thing or you don't want to, dive into the function or the method that you're using in that documentation and understand it completely before you start using something that you've never used before. And that'll save you a lot of time and understanding of how that method works or troubleshooting that you're going to run into.
I fall into that trap a lot because we live in an era where there's like so much effort and care put into the open source in the world that if you copy paste the first example from the open source documentation site, it actually works a lot of the time. But then the natural next step is to get stuck because you didn't actually read about how they intend for you to use that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Happens all the time. You just get too comfortable. We all just want to build, and sometimes you just want to dive straight in, and we all make that same mistake.
Your future self will thank you.
Yes. Or write tests to test your assumptions of how things are supposed to work, which is a whole other topic.
Right. For another day, sure.
All right, everyone. It's pretty late for those on the East Coast and such. Thank you for hanging out and extending your stay, Nate, Chris. Mati's on the West Coast, so I won't thank him. He's no, just kidding. Yeah, thanks everyone. It was a pleasure. We got to do more of these conversations.
For sure.
Absolutely.
For sure.
This is great.
All right.
I definitely learned a few things.
All right, everyone. Take it easy.
Have a good one.
Bye.
See ya.
Cheers.
Thanks.
Bye.
All right, everyone. That's it. Thanks everyone for hanging out, lurking, whatever you were doing. I greatly appreciate that. Yeah, if there was a lot of great tidbits in the stream, I feel for anyone that's debugging, honestly, from beginner to intermediate to advanced level programmers. I think everyone on the stream learned a lot. I learned a couple new tips. So highly recommend. Yeah. I'm gonna highlight this video, keep it so it's permanently on Twitch. I will upload this to YouTube and such. So if you have anyone that you feel like can need some advice or need some help on leveling up on debugging, hopefully this stream is going to help a lot with that. So thanks everyone for lurking and hanging out. Really appreciate it. I had a great time. And I hope you will too. And have a great weekend. It is Friday, so everyone take it easy. We'll be back again next Friday, and here at Zeal, we're gonna have a whole new cohort of interns in. So I'm going to take the opportunity to interview the new interns together. There's 4 of them, so we're gonna interview them all 4 together next week. We'll learn who they are, how they got into the bootcamp school, their experiences. So we have a new set of interns to ask questions about getting into bootcamp schools and where they came from and what they learned and all type of stuff. So that should be a fun stream. It's going to be a packed house. So stay tuned for that. All right. Thank you, everyone. Sausage Cam, Lily. Thank you, Lurking Cat, for lurking. And everyone else. And thank you to Nate, Mati, Chris, and Dr. Argus for helping out. Well, thanks again, everyone. Have a good weekend. I will see you on the Discords, Twitters, the Twitches, and any other sort of social, interactive, online media source thingamajigger. Until next time, I'll catch you later. Ooh, but before we officially go, we have to raid. Someone. Who should we raid? That is a great question. Let's raid over to Adam13531. He is Adam. His name's Adam. his channel's all about learning. So if you want to learn about how to build stuff, how to do stuff, Adam is your guy. He was formerly making a game and now has pivoted into becoming a full-time streamer, learning new things every day and new content I'm not sure if every week or basically some new content every month. He's going to be learning something new. So let's head over that way and check that out. Have a good rest of your day, everyone. Thanks again. See you later. Bye.